On the morning of July 16, 1969, a Saturn V stood on Pad 39A, carrying roughly 2,900 tons of vehicle and propellant. 4 days later, the part of it that touched the moon settled onto the Sea of Tranquility with 216 pounds of usable fuel in its tanks. 98 kilograms. That is what survived the journey. The margin between a landing and an abort, measured in less than the weight of 2 men. Everything between those two numbers is the subject of this video. NASA's own mission weights record the whole chain. Apollo 11 reached Earth orbit as 45,702 kilograms of spacecraft. It set 7,327 down on the moon. It lifted 4,888 back off, and 4,932 kilograms came home. Of the 2,900 tons that left the pad, 1 part in 588 returned. 57 years later, that ratio has not improved. It cannot. It is arithmetic, not engineering. What has changed is the price of the first step. Getting to low Earth orbit has become cheap in a way almost nothing else in industrial history has become cheap. Getting past low Earth orbit has not moved. Here is the gap in one pair of numbers. A kilogram to orbit on a shared Falcon 9 ride costs about $7,000. The published rate is $350,000 for the first 50 kilograms, then $7,000 for each one after. A kilogram delivered to the lunar surface, priced from NASA's own contracts, costs about $1.2 million. The Inspector General published that figure in June 2024, derived from the task orders NASA signed in 2023. It was 20% higher than the agency's own 2019 estimate. The cost of reaching orbit fell by a factor of 20. The cost of reaching the moon went up. Two organizations are attacking that gap right now, from opposite directions with incompatible architectures. One is trying to build a fuel depot in orbit that has never existed. The other is trying to avoid needing one. Both are writing rules that everyone who comes after will have to work inside. Neither has finished. Start with what actually worked, because it is easy to lose sight of how strange it is. In a 2018 analysis for NASA Ames, engineer Harry Jones priced launch systems in constant dollars. The space shuttle delivered a kilogram to orbit for $61,720. The Falcon 9 delivered one for $2,720, a factor of 23 inside a single working career. And Jones was writing before reuse became routine. The consequence shows up in tonnage. Astronomer Jonathan McDowell has tracked orbital payload mass for decades. In 2023, the world placed 1,478.9 tons into orbit. In 2024, 2,541.1. In 2025, 3,193.4, more than double the 2023 figure in 2 years. Nothing in the history of spaceflight resembles that curve. The composition matters more than the total. Of the 3,193.4 tons lifted in 2025, commercial operators accounted for 2,578.8, 81%. Civil space agencies contributed 195.2 tons. Defense, 233.3. The state did not lift the mass that made this decade different. A handful of companies did, mostly to serve their own constellations. The mechanism was reuse, and reuse is now boring, which is the point. Worldwide orbital launch attempts went from 223 in 2023 to 329 in 2025, of which 321 reached orbit, and a single company flew more than half of them. On July 9, 2026, a Falcon 9 first stage flew for the 36th time. The Space Shuttle Discovery flew 39 missions across 27 years. One booster nearly matched that in under a decade, and the fastest turnaround for a single stage has been 9 days. SpaceX flew 165 Falcon 9 missions in 2025. 123 of them carried its own satellites. That achievement is real. It is also strictly local. Every one of those flights ends a few hundred kilometers up, in the shallowest part of the gravity well. The economics reuse rewrote apply to a shell around the Earth, about as thick as the distance from Lisbon to Madrid. Past that shell, the old prices hold. And the reason is not a lack of ambition. SpaceX publishes a capabilities document. It lists the Falcon 9 at 22,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit, 8,300 to geostationary transfer, and 4,020 to Mars. Same rocket, same engines, same propellant load. The destination alone cuts the payload by a factor of 5.5. The Falcon Heavy brochure shows the same collapse: 63.8 tons to orbit, 16.8 to Mars. That is the rocket equation stated in a product brochure. Every increment of velocity costs an exponential increment of propellant, and the propellant itself has mass that must also be accelerated. Reaching orbit takes roughly 9.4 kilometers per second of velocity change. Leaving orbit for the Moon takes another 3. Slowing into lunar orbit and descending to the surface takes about 2.6 more. Each step eats the margin the previous one left, and the propellant for the later steps must be dragged through all the earlier ones. Reuse does not touch this. A reusable booster cuts the cost of the hardware you throw at the problem. It does not cut the energy the problem requires. Cheap access to orbit made the first 9 kilometers per second affordable. It made the next 6 no cheaper, because those are bought entirely with propellant lifted from the ground at a cost of its own. This is why the CLPS number is $1.2 million per kilogram, while the rideshare number is 7,000. NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program is not badly run. The Inspector General found cost growth of $208.2 million and average delays of at least 14 months per task order, which is ordinary for immature hardware. The price is not a management failure. It is what the physics costs when every gram of fuel used beyond orbit was carried up from sea level. So there is one structural way out, obvious since the 1960s. Stop carrying the fuel. Launch the vehicle nearly empty and fill it once it is already in orbit. That single idea is the hinge the American deep space architecture now turns on, and it has never been done. Consider what a Starship holds. Its tanks take roughly 1,200 tons of liquid oxygen and liquid methane. The vehicle's own structure is on the order of 100. The payload, in the best case anyone claims, is another 100. For every kilogram of cargo, the machine carries something like 12 kilograms of propellant just to move itself. Fill those tanks on the ground, and you can reach orbit. You arrive with tanks nearly dry, a vehicle in the right place, and no ability to go anywhere else. To continue to the Moon, the vehicle needs those 1,200 tons again, in orbit, where there is nothing to fill them from. So SpaceX proposed the only answer that closes. Launch more Starships, each carrying propellant instead of cargo, and pump it across in orbit. Park a depot vehicle in low Earth orbit, send tankers up to fill it. When it holds enough, transfer everything into the lander and depart for the Moon. The lander never carries its lunar propellant off the ground. The idea is not new. An internal NASA study reported in 2011 concluded that a depot-based architecture using smaller rockets would cost $57 billion less over 20 years than one built around a heavy launcher. The elegance is genuine. It converts an exponential problem into a linear one. Instead of building an impossibly large rocket, you fly a merely large one many times. It is the reason a fully loaded Starship can, on paper, put more mass on the lunar surface than the Saturn V put into Earth orbit. It is also the reason a single lunar landing becomes a launch campaign rather than a launch. And it moves the hard part somewhere new. The engineering risk is no longer in the rocket. It is a plumbing operation between two vehicles moving at 7.8 kilometers per second with cryogenic fluids that have no fixed surface in weightlessness through a coupling that must seal near minus 180 degrees Celsius on a schedule set by evaporation. Nobody has done it. How many times it must work per mission is disputed by the people building it. The dispute over that number is worth walking through carefully because it is the clearest window into how uncertain this architecture still is. In its August 2021 decision rejecting the protests against the SpaceX award, the Government Accountability Office described 16 launches per mission, 1 lander, 14 tankers, and 1 whose purpose was redacted. That was the earliest published count. Elon Musk contested it publicly that same month. At most 8 tanker flights, he said, and possibly as few as 4. In 2024, SpaceX Vice President Jessica Jensen offered 10-ish, with the caveat that it was subject to change. In November 2023, Lakeisha Hawkins of NASA's Moon to Mars Program Office told an advisory council committee the figure was in the high teens and attributed the number to boil off in the depot, which forces the flights to be crowded together. The most authoritative figure available is also the most recent. NASA's Office of Inspector General, in report IG-26-004, published March 10, 2026, states that more than 10 Starship tankers are required, and that SpaceX targets one tanker launch every 6 days until enough propellant has accumulated. That is an audit document describing SpaceX's own plan of record. One correction matters here, because the error is common. The figure of nearly 20 launches circulates widely as a GAO finding. It is not. The GAO's November 2023 Artemis report, GAO-24-106256, describes a depot followed by multiple tankers and gives no count at all. The 20 came from a NASA official speaking at a public meeting. Auditors and officials are not the same source, and the distinction changes how much weight the number carries. What survives is a range, not a number, between 4 and 19 refueling flights per lunar landing, depending on who is speaking and which vehicle generation they assume. Former NASA Administrator Mike Griffin ran the compounding. At 5 tanker flights, mission success probability holds near 90%. At 20, it falls to 67. Every added flight is another chance for the campaign to stall, and the clock that forces them together is thermodynamic. Liquid oxygen boils at -183 degrees Celsius. Liquid methane at -162. In orbit, sunlight and earthshine deliver heat continuously, and there's no atmosphere to carry it away. Only radiators, insulation, and time. Propellant in a depot does not sit still. It evaporates. The rates are small and merciless. Stored liquid oxygen loses roughly 0.016% per day under standard assumptions. Liquid hydrogen, far worse, around 0.13%. A 2010 NASA study of a Mars architecture found that boil-off alone added 70 tons of propellant to the requirement, an entire additional heavy launch spent on fuel that would never burn. United Launch Alliance once proposed a tanker stage carrying up to 73 tons of propellant for exactly this purpose. It was never funded. Methane and oxygen are more forgiving than hydrogen, which is why SpaceX chose them. They are not forgiving enough to ignore. This is precisely why the Inspector General's document specifies a tanker every 6 days, rather than simply more than 10 tankers. The requirement is not a quantity of flights. It is a quantity of flights inside a window, and the window is set by how fast the first load disappears. Run the consequences. More than 10 flights at one per 6 days is a campaign of at least 2 months in which nothing may fail. No scrub, no anomaly, no range conflict, no weather hold long enough to matter. NASA's account describes the flights alternating between Texas and Florida to sustain the rhythm. It is the logistics problem that governs container ports and just-in-time factories transplanted to a launch pad. NASA has been working the underlying physics for years. Glenn and Ames tested active cooling systems that cut hydrogen boil-off by 45 to 48% and drove a liquid oxygen surrogate to zero boil-off using an 8.5-watt cryocooler drawing 145 watts of input power. Those tests were on a tank 1.22 meters across. The depot is a Starship. Nobody has published a boil-off rate for it, which is the honest summary of where the technology stands. In October 2020, NASA awarded SpaceX $53.2 million under its Tipping Point program for a large-scale flight demonstration. Transfer 10 tons of cryogenic propellant, specifically liquid oxygen, between tanks on a Starship vehicle. It was one of 14 awards, totaling $372 million, alongside Lockheed Martin, ULA, and ETA Space, all aimed at the same missing capability. Part of it has already been done. On Flight 3 in March 2024, Starship moved 10 tons of liquid oxygen between 2 tanks inside the same vehicle. That validates fluid behavior in weightlessness. It does not validate the operation that the lunar architecture requires, which involves 2 separate vehicles finding each other in orbit, docking, and passing propellant across. That test has slipped, repeatedly. In November 2024, NASA's Kent Chang'e said ship-to-ship work would begin around March 2025 and finish that summer, calling it a big building block. The architecture was described by NASA's Amit Kshatriya. A target vehicle launches first, a chaser follows 3 to 4 weeks later, docks, and transfers. By the time IG-26004 was published, the demonstration had moved from March 2025 to March 2026. 12 months of slip on a single test. As of August 2026, Starship has flown 13 integrated test flights across 4 years. None reached orbit. 2 vehicles have never met in space, never docked, and never passed propellant. The July 24, 2026 flight was the program's best to date. The ship survived re-entry and splashed down intact off Western Australia for the first time, and was recovered for analysis. It was still suborbital. SpaceX's own securities filing, published in 2026, still lists in-orbit propellant transfer among the key milestones the company has yet to demonstrate. The Inspector General added a structural caveat that has received less attention than it deserves. End-to-end propellant aggregation, the audit says, will not be fully flight tested because the uncrewed demonstration vehicles carry less propellant than the crewed lander will. The full-scale version of the operation is scheduled to happen for the first time during a mission with astronauts aboard. On October 20th, 2025, Acting NASA Administrator Sean Duffy announced that the Artemis III lunar lander contract would be opened to competition. The award had been SpaceX's since 2021. "We're not going to wait for one company," Duffy said. "Whatever one can get us there first, to the moon, we're going to take." He added in a post, "A little competition doesn't hurt, and it spurs innovation." The stated reason was schedule, and specifically the risk of arriving after China. The technical reason underneath it was named directly in the coverage. SpaceX had not demonstrated orbital refueling. Former Administrator Jim Bridenstine described the requirement in plain terms: flying Starship over and over dozens of times with no delays and no explosions, simply to fuel the first one. The contract was not canceled. SpaceX and Blue Origin were given until October 29th to submit acceleration approaches, and the rest of the industry was invited to respond to a request for information. Lockheed Martin signaled it would assemble a team. Duffy acknowledged that Artemis III would not launch in mid-2027 as planned. The audit, published 5 months later, put numbers on what prompted it. SpaceX's lander was originally due in June 2025. The target had moved to June 2027, a slip of roughly 24 months, and the Inspector General wrote flatly that the lander would not be ready for a lunar surface mission by that date. The potential value of the SpaceX contract stands near $4.3 billion. Blue Origin's, awarded in May 2023, near $3.1 billion. NASA has obligated $6.9 billion for lander development and projects, spending $18.3 billion through fiscal 2030. The same report raised concerns that have nothing to do with fuel and everything to do with what the fuel requirement forced. The Starship lander stands about 52 meters tall against roughly 16 for Blue Origin's, on terrain the auditors describe as uneven, a stability question. Crew reached the surface by a 115-foot elevator, and the report notes there is currently no other method for the crew to re-enter the vehicle if it fails. It also states that NASA does not have the capability to strap crew. 4 months later, on February 27, 2026, Administrator Jared Isaacman restructured the program. Artemis III would no longer be a lunar landing. It became a test flight in Earth orbit, with the landing pushed to Artemis IV in early 2028, and Artemis V at the end of that year. The justification he gave is the single most important sentence in this story. Flying the mission in Earth orbit, Isaacman said, allows the integrated test of Orion with the lander without the need for SpaceX to demonstrate cryogenic propellant transfer. Sending astronauts on a landing before testing how Orion interfaces with the lander, he added, adds risk. Read that plainly. The refueling problem did not delay a schedule. It redefined a mission. The flight that was supposed to return humans to the lunar surface was converted into a rendezvous exercise a few hundred kilometers above the Earth, specifically because the propellant transfer it depended on could not be relied on in time. The revised profile, confirmed in June 2026, has the crew docking in Earth orbit first with Blue Origin's Blue Moon Mark 1, and then with a Starship V3, including a hatch opening test on the Blue Origin vehicle. The mission runs about 2 weeks and never leaves Earth orbit. In the architecture that follows, Starship, not Orion, would perform the translunar injection for Artemis IV. NASA canceled the exploration upper stage and paused the Gateway station, whose contracts had already reached roughly $4.4 billion. Blue Origin's lander moved in the same audit, from April 2028 to March 2030, a slip of roughly 23 months. Set against the underlying costs, the restructuring reads as a system absorbing a single, unproven technology. The Inspector General projects $4.1 billion per SLS and Orion launch. Through fiscal 2025, the Artemis campaign was projected at $93 billion. Congress appropriated $24.44 billion for NASA in fiscal 2026, signed on January 23rd, of which $7.783 billion went to exploration. That is what the American approach costs, while its central enabling step remains a demonstration on a schedule. China's crude lunar architecture solves the same problem by refusing to have it. Each mission uses 2 launches of a Long March 10. One carries the Lan-Yue lander, the other carries the Mengzhou crew capsule. They meet in low lunar orbit, dock, land 2 astronauts, and return. There is no depot, no tanker campaign, and no orbital propellant transfer anywhere in the sequence. The numbers explain the choice. The Long March 10 lifts 2,187 tons off the pad and delivers 70 tons to low Earth orbit and at least 27 toward the Moon. Mengzhou masses about 21,600 kilograms and carries 3 astronauts on a lunar mission. Lan-Yue, fully fueled, comes to roughly 26,000 kilograms, 4 YF-36 engines, and about 6 tons of storable propellant. 2 launches of 27 tons each is enough for that stack. It is not enough for anything larger. That is the trade, stated honestly. China buys schedule certainty by accepting a small mission. 2 people on the surface, a short stay, no reusable lander, no permanent infrastructure delivered in the same flight. The American architecture buys enormous surface payload capacity and pays for it with a technology that does not yet work. The Chinese hardware has been moving through tests on a visible cadence. On June 17, 2025, Mengzhou completed a pad abort at Jiuquan, ignition at 12:30, landing 2 minutes later, only the second zero-altitude abort test China had run in 27 years. On August 6, 2025, Lan-Yue completed an integrated landing and ascent test at a facility in Huailai, Hebei, validating the contact shutdown logic and the coupling between guidance and propulsion. The hardest one came on February 11, 2026. A Long March 10, A, test article separated the Mengzhou capsule at maximum dynamic pressure, around 65 seconds into flight at roughly 10 kilometers of altitude. 3 parachutes, totaling more than 2,400 square meters, slowed the capsule from 80 meters per second to under 10, and it was recovered at sea the same day. The agency declared it a complete success. The orbital flight of Mengzhou is targeted for late 2026, and the crewed landing before 2030. China's bottleneck is not the lunar architecture. It is everything the lunar architecture has to share a launch industry with. In 2023, China attempted 67 orbital launches. In 2024, 68. In 2025, 92, a 35% jump, and a national record confirmed by state media, carrying more than 300 satellites. Almost all of that growth was consumed by 2 constellations. Guowang is planned at 12,992 satellites. Qianfan is comparable in ambition. Together, they absorbed roughly 45 launches in 2025 and are projected to require more than 70 in 2026, on a base that stood at 53 launches by early August. The mega constellations are not a side project competing for pad time. They are most of the manifest. Reuse, which is what broke the American cost curve, arrived in China only recently, and only once. On July 10, 2026, the Long March 10B flew for the first time and recovered its first stage aboard the autonomous vessel Linghongzhe, 430 kilometers downrange, the first proven Chinese booster recovery. The vehicle is 70.2 meters tall, masses 760 tons fueled, and generates 892 tons of thrust from 7 YF-100K engines. The payload was an experimental satellite for the operator behind Guowang. That success was state-owned. The commercial sector has not matched it. Landspace flew Zhuche 3 for the first time on December 3, 2025, and the booster did not survive the landing. A second attempt was scheduled for late August 2026. Space Pioneer's Tianlong 3 failed on its maiden flight on April 3, 2026, when a first-stage engine overexpanded and the vehicle diverged from its trajectory. Galactic Energy, iSpace, and Orionspace have not yet flown their reusable vehicles at all. Failures have been visible elsewhere too. On August 10, 2026, a Long March 7A broke up about 83 seconds after liftoff at Wenchang, losing a geostationary communication satellite, the vehicle's second failure in 18 missions. Chinese industry coverage in mid-2026 described the commercial sector's problem as manufacturing rather than design, moving from hand-built vehicles to mass production. New commercial pads at Hainan and Wenchang were under construction through 2026 for exactly that reason. There is one part of this where China moved first, and it went largely unremarked. On January 6, 2025, a Long March 3B lifted the Shijian-25 satellite from Xichang. The stated purpose was to advance key technologies for on-orbit refueling and satellite life extension. Between July 2nd and July 6, 2025, Shijian-25 and the older Shijian-21 appeared visually merged in optical sensor data at geostationary altitude, 35,786 kilometers up. The approach had been building for weeks. Rendezvous attempts on June 11th, June 13th, and June 30th. The operation was tracked by the American commercial firm ComSpock, watched by 2 U.S. surveillance satellites, and observed independently by a Swiss company. ComSpock described it as an autonomous satellite servicing achievement the United States had not yet matched. The caveats are important and should not be skipped. China has not officially confirmed that propellant was transferred. No source publishes how much. All of the evidence is external optical tracking of 2 objects that appeared to occupy the same position and later separated. What can be said is what was observed. 2 spacecraft met, stayed together for days, and parted. It is also a different problem than the one Starship faces. Shijian-25 handles storable hypergolic propellants at ambient temperature, in tiny quantities, in a quiet orbit far from anything. Starship must move hundreds of tons of cryogenic fluid that is actively boiling between vehicles the size of office buildings on a 6-day clock. Nobody should read the geostationary docking as evidence that the lunar problem is solved. But the sequencing matters for how the rules get written. American programs have been chasing the same capability with far more money and far more announcements. The Space Force put $44.5 million into its Tetra 5 refueling demonstration and $25.5 million into an Astra-scale servicing vehicle, and its on-orbit refueling demonstrations slipped from late 2026 to early 2027. OrbitFab published a price, $20 million for up to 100 kilograms of hydrazine in geostationary orbit, before it had a customer flying. The demonstration that actually appeared to happen happened quietly in January and July of 2025. Every architecture so far shares one assumption: the propellant comes from Earth. Whether you launch it in one enormous rocket or 10 tankers, whether you transfer it in orbit or avoid transferring it, the molecules start at the bottom of the deepest gravity well around. Remove that assumption, and the supply chain inverts. The physics of the inversion is dramatic. A NASA study of cislunar propellant infrastructure found that a reusable lunar lander delivers about 63% of its initial mass to low lunar orbit, while an Earth launcher delivers 3 to 4% of liftoff mass to low Earth orbit. Reaching the Lagrange point EML1 costs about 4 kilograms of propellant per kilogram delivered from the Moon, against roughly 25 from Earth. The catch is energy. A 2025 analysis published in PNAS modeled end-to-end production of liquid oxygen from lunar regolith by hydrogen reduction and found it costs 24.3 kilowatt-hours per kilogram, plus or minus 5.8. 93% of that goes into just 2 steps: the reduction reaction and the electrolysis that follows. Extracting oxygen from water ice instead is far cheaper, about 11.3 kilowatt-hours per kilogram, roughly half. Translate that into infrastructure. NASA's own water mining architecture needs 68 kilowatts of electrical power to produce 10 tons of oxygen a year, mining 398 tons of regolith to do it. A commercial concept sized for 450 tons of propellant annually needs 2.8 megawatts and $4 billion of capital. Break-even in the peer-reviewed modeling is measured in years rather than tons. Competitive for geostationary transfer around year 5 to 7. Which is why the ice matters more than any other single variable in this story. The regolith route works anywhere on the Moon and costs twice as much energy. The ice route is cheaper, and it exists in exactly one kind of place: permanently shadowed craters near the poles, cold enough that water deposited over billions of years never sublimated away. Everything, The landing sites, the reactors, the treaties, follows from where that ice is. And in the last 3 years, the science has been moving in an uncomfortable direction. The foundational measurement is still the best one. In 2009, NASA drove a spent rocket stage into Cabeus crater near the lunar South Pole and flew a second spacecraft through the plume. Reanalysis, published in 2020, estimated the crater's total ice content at 500 million tons, with an uncertainty of plus or minus 300 million. Orbital spectroscopy complicated the picture rather than confirming it. The Moon Mineralogy Mapper aboard Chandrayaan-1 found the spectral signature of surface ice in only about 3.5% of the cold traps it examined. Each pixel covers 280 meters on a side, which is a coarse way to plan a mine. Then came 3 papers pointing the same way. In 2023, Norbert Schurghofer and colleagues showed in Science Advances that the permanently shadowed regions of the South Pole are no older than about 3.4 billion years, younger than the craters containing them, because a shift in the Moon's rotation axis roughly 4.1 billion years ago would have destroyed any earlier deposits. Prior estimates, the authors wrote, needed to be revised sharply downward. In April 2026, a team using ShadowCam aboard the Korean orbiter Danuri published the most direct check yet. They found no widespread concentration of ice above 20 to 30% by mass anywhere in the permanently shadowed regions. Only isolated patches 20 to 50 meters across exceeding 10%. The lead author's summary was blunt. He had expected more bright, ice-rich areas, and the small number they found was surprising. None of this says the ice is absent. It says the accessible, mineable form of it has not been shown to exist, and that the uncertainty runs in the expensive direction. A commercial prospectus published in 2025 listed the open questions. Nobody knows whether the deposits sit under dry overburden, whether the ice forms solid lenses or binds to individual grains, or whether orbital imagery approaches the resolution industrial planning requires. Landing at the pole also costs about 1,200 meters per second, against 850 at the equator, nearly double the energy to reach a resource whose grade is unmeasured. Suppose the ice is there. Extracting it still requires power, continuously, in a place that spends half its time in darkness. The lunar night lasts about 14 Earth days, and in some non-polar locations, as long as 16, 384 hours without sunlight. The thermal numbers are what make it expensive. Equatorial surface temperatures swing from about 374 Kelvin in daylight to 92 at night. Inside permanently shadowed craters, the places holding the ice, they reach 40 Kelvin, minus 233 Celsius. An ESA analysis calculated that keeping a generic 1 square meter module from cooling below minus 40 across a single lunar night takes 3,200 to 3,700 watt-hours, roughly 20 kilograms of lithium-ion battery. A 200 kilogram lander would need about 100 kilograms of battery just to survive until morning. That is why the electrical requirement escalated the way it did. NASA's Fission Surface Power program began in 2020, asking for at least 10 kilowatts. By November 2021, the requirement was 40 kilowatts electric at a maximum of 6 tons. And in June 2022, 3 teams, led by Lockheed Martin, Westinghouse, and a joint venture of Intuitive Machines and X-Energy, received $5 million each to design it. On August 4, 2025, an administrator's directive changed the target again, 100 kilowatts electric, closed Brayton cycle conversion, ready to launch in the first quarter of fiscal 2030, sized for a heavy lander of up to 15 tons. NASA and the Department of Energy signed a Memorandum of Understanding on January 8, 2026 to accelerate it. Trade coverage noted the obvious ambiguity, whether the reactor would be operating on the Moon in 2030 or merely built and waiting. The other side has the same requirement and a similar date. In May 2025, during a state visit to Moscow, China's space agency and Roscosmos signed a memorandum on a lunar nuclear power plant, described as a contribution to the International Lunar Research Station, and targeted for around 2035, operating without a crew. No electrical output has been published. Both programs concluded that solar panels do not close the problem, and both are building fission plants for a supply chain that does not exist yet. The Moon's South Pole is not a region so much as a scattering of high ground between craters. Because the Moon's axis is tilted only about 1.5 degrees, The sun never rises far above the horizon there. Crater floors stay dark permanently. A handful of ridges and peaks stay lit almost permanently. Almost everything else alternates. The scarcity is quantifiable. A 2025 analysis in remote sensing, derived from laser altimeter topography, found that 78% of the South Polar region receives less than 35% illumination. 35% was the minimum the Chinese site selection study set for a mission expected to last 8 years. The usable ground is the residual, a small fraction of a region that is itself a small fraction of the moon. The peaks that do stay lit are correspondingly valuable. Modeling published in 2021 found that with 20-meter towers, areas illuminated more than 90% of the time could support roughly 6 megawatts of solar capacity across the entire South Pole. 6 megawatts. That is the total continuous solar budget of the most valuable real estate on another world, and it sits directly adjacent to the shadowed craters where the ice is. Ground truth is thinner than the modeling. India's Chandrayaan-3 returned the first in-situ thermal profile near the South Polar region in 2023 and measured surface temperatures higher than models had predicted. That adjacency is the whole geographic problem. The resource is in permanent darkness at 40 Kelvin. The power to extract it is on ridges a few kilometers away in near-permanent sunlight. Any operation has to straddle both, mining in the cold trap, processing on the rim, moving material between them across terrain that has never been surveyed at industrial resolution. NASA's own water mining architecture splits its 68 kilowatts accordingly, 46 at the processing site on the ridge, 22 at the mining site below. So the number of places on the moon that can host a propellant industry is not large. It is a short list of named features, and both programs have been publishing their lists. In August 2022, NASA identified 13 candidate regions for the Artemis 3 landing, each roughly 15 kilometers across and all within 6 degrees of the South Pole. In October 2024, the agency narrowed the list to 9: Peak near KBSB, Hayworth, Malapert Massif, Mons Mouton Plateau, Mons Mouton, Nobile Rim 1, Nobile Rim 2, Daguerreauche Rim 2, and Slater Plain. China published its own analysis. A 2025 peer-reviewed study of Chang'e 7 site selection screened 61 large cold traps, refined them to 11, and settled on 6 optimal sites. 3 of the 6 are on Daguerreauche. The declared target for the mission is a peak on the southeastern ridge of Shackleton Crater at 88 degrees 48 minutes south, 123 degrees 24 minutes east. Its launch window opened on August 24, 2026. Then there is Chang'e 8, the mission carrying China's in-situ resource experiments, including 3 de-printing bricks from lunar soil. In April 2025, its site selection was narrowed to a plateau near Mons Mouton, also called Leibniz Beta. Mons Mouton appears twice on NASA's list of 9. Other Chang'e 8 candidates named publicly include Amundsen Crater, Cabeus Crater, and the ridge connecting Shackleton to Daguerreauche. Amundsen Rim was on NASA's original 13. Peak near Cabeus B is on the current 9. This is not a coincidence of naming. Both programs ran the same physics against the same topographic dataset and arrived at the same shortlist. Because the constraints are identical: continuous sunlight for power, proximity to a cold trap for the ice, Earth visibility for communications, and a slope gentle enough to land on. 78% of the region fails the illumination test. What passes is what both sides selected. Space News put the situation plainly as early as 2022. It is not clear how the two countries will coordinate their respective lunar plans. 4 years later, that remains an accurate description. There is no shared schedule, no notification protocol between the programs, and no agreed method for one to tell the other where it intends to operate. What exists instead is a body of law written in 1967, when this question was hypothetical. The Outer Space Treaty entered into force in October 1967 and has 118 states parties. Article 2 is one sentence. Outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. Notice what that sentence covers and what it does not. It forbids claiming territory. It says nothing about owning material extracted from that territory. The distinction separates a mining claim from a mineral. You cannot own the crater, but the text does not address who owns the water you pull out of it. That gap is where every national space resources law of the past decade has been written. The United States moved first. The The Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act was signed on November 25, 2015. Its Title IV entitles a citizen engaged in commercial recovery to possess, own, transport, use, and sell any space resource obtained. Luxembourg's law took effect on August 2, 2017, and its first article reads, in the official translation, "Space resources are capable of being owned." The Emirates followed in 2019, and Japan with Act No. 83, in force that December of 2021, under which the permit holder owns what the approved activity extracts. The Artemis Accords, opened for signature on October 13, 2020, generalize the position. Section 10 states that the extraction of space resources does not inherently constitute national appropriation under Article 2. Section 11 asks signatories to respect reasonable safety zones to avoid harmful interference, defining a safety zone as the area where nominal operations or an anomalous event could reasonably cause interference. 70 nations have signed. Mauritius became the 70th on July 17, 2026. The competing framework is thinner than its coverage suggests. The International Lunar Research Station, founded jointly by China and Russia in June 2021, counts 17 countries and organizations, plus more than 50 research institutions. Its declared principles are equality, mutual benefit, peaceful use, and win-win cooperation. The Secure World Foundation's assessment is that no details of those principles are publicly available. There is no ILRS text on resource ownership to compare against. Section 10. So what actually happens if two programs want the same ridge? Start with what exists. The International Telecommunication Union coordinates radio frequencies for lunar missions and has done so for decades. It established the shielded zone of the Moon in 1971, protecting the far side from emissions originating within 100,000 kilometers of Earth. In 2023, the World Radio Communication Conference put lunar surface communications on the agenda for its 2027 session, item 1.15, to build a spectrum management framework for the lunar surface and for links between lunar orbit and the ground. That is a real mechanism, and it covers spectrum only. There is no equivalent for terrain. No international body registers a landing site. No process exists to file a claim on a peak, reserve a crater, or notify another program of an intended operating area. The Artemis Accords safety zones bind signatories to one another. They are a political commitment among 70 governments, not a treaty, and China is not among them. The only instrument that binds everyone is Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty. It obliges states to conduct activities with due regard to the corresponding interests of all other parties, and to undertake appropriate international consultations before proceeding with an activity that might cause harmful interference. Those are the operative words: due regard and appropriate consultations. The treaty names no court, appoints no arbiter, and specifies no penalty. Compare that to how the equivalent problem was solved on Earth. Geostationary orbital slots are allocated through the ITU with filings, priority dates, and bring into use deadlines. Maritime boundaries have a tribunal. Aviation has ICAO. Every mature transport domain built a registry before it built congestion. Cislunar space is arriving at congestion first. And congestion here does not mean crowding. It means two national programs on schedules within a few years of each other, targeting overlapping ground on the only part of the Moon where a propellant industry can be built, under a treaty that asks them to consult, with no venue in which to do it. That is the legal state of the supply chain. The commercial state is not much more settled. Follow the money, and the asymmetry is stark. NASA received $24.44 billion for fiscal 2026, of which $7.783 billion went to exploration. Estimates of Chinese government space spending cluster around 15 to 20 billion a year, and every one is a third-party estimate because no consolidated official number is published. Global government space spending reached $137.4 billion in 2025. The private side changed shape in June 2026. SpaceX listed on the NASDAQ on the 12th, raising roughly $75 billion at a valuation above $2 trillion. That created something that had not existed before, a securities filing. Its S-1 reports 2025 revenue of $18.674 billion, of which $11.387 billion came from connectivity, largely Starlink, and $4.086 billion from the space segment. About a fifth of sales came from the US government, And the filing states that the company is its primary launch provider. The filing also shows what the deep space business currently costs. In the second quarter of 2026, the space segment posted $962 million of revenue against a $542 million operating loss, attributed to Starship development. The connectivity segment earned $4.3 billion in the same quarter, with $1.66 billion of operating profit. Starlink is paying for Starship, and the arrangement is visible in a public document for the first time. Underneath both programs sits a supply chain narrower than either. A 2026 study by the Aerospace Industries Association and PwC identified 9 specialized components with capacity gaps across the U.S. space sector. Optical intersatellite links, actuators, engine nozzles, composite pressure vessels, connectors, switchgears, cryogenic valves, FPGAs, and post-processing treatments. Many are served by 3 or fewer qualified domestic suppliers. China refines about 91% of the world's rare earths, and its export controls announced October 9, 2025, covered 13 of those elements, with magnet restrictions effective December 1st. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, mechanisms traced to the documents that describe them, subscribing helps more than it sounds like it does. And if there is a supply chain you think deserves this treatment, leave it in the comments. Several of these videos started there. Return to the 98 kilograms. Apollo did not solve the problem. It paid for it once, at enormous expense, for a handful of missions, and then stopped. Nothing about the arithmetic changed when the program ended. It was simply no longer being purchased. What is being attempted now differs in kind. Both programs are building towards something repeatable, a route flown again, without spending a national fortune each time. And both converged on the same recognition. The binding constraint past low Earth orbit is not thrust, not money, and not political will. It is where the propellant comes from and how it reaches the vehicle that needs it. The two answers are not compatible. One accepts a small mission it can fly soon with hardware that has passed its abort tests and builds the supply chain afterward. The other builds the supply chain first as an orbital depot and lets the first landing wait until the depot works. As of August 2026, the first approach has flown a max-Q abort and recovered a booster. The second has flown 13 times without reaching orbit and has watched a lunar landing mission reclassified as an Earth orbit rendezvous to route around the missing capability. Whichever demonstrates propellant transfer at scale first sets the standard everyone else plugs into. The interfaces, the pressures, the protocols, the boil-off tolerances a depot must meet to be worth docking with. That is what infrastructure standards are, whatever the first working system happened to do. Rail gauges and container dimensions were decided this way, by whoever built first and at scale, and the world routed around the result for a century. No treaty assigns that role, no registry records the claim, and no tribunal would hear a dispute about it. Article 9 asks for due regard. The Artemis Accords ask 70 signatories to respect safety zones China never agreed to. The ITU discusses lunar spectrum in 2027. Meanwhile, 2 programs converge on the same handful of sunlit ridges above the same shadowed craters, for the same reason. That is where the fuel might be. The law governing what happens next is not being written in a treaty hall. It is being written by whichever architecture works first.